So let's just go ahead and do a rough tier list. Tier 1, again, these are first impressions. Take this with a grain of salt. But right now, Demacia Allegiance is going to be very good. Something with Bannerman. I suspect Zed for the splash is going to be the second color. You can do it in a lot of ways. There's 6-O's Demacia Allegiance deck that runs like some of the barrier package with Shen. That works okay. Okay? Then there's the Lux version, which I suspect is going to end up being a Heimer deck. We'll see. But that's like Lux. Let's say Heimer, or it could be Karma, right? Spooky Karma, I think at a very, very high level, Spooky Karma is still going to maintain Nuts value. I don't know if I can call it tier 1 overall, because I think that while it's a very good deck at a high level, it's probably quite tricky to play. So I might put that in tier 2 ultimately, even though, of course, it's Nuts at a high level. So Spooky Karma is going to maintain a ton of value, as is Kinko Wayfinders. Kinko Wayfinders, you know, they lose 1 attack on Conspirator. There is a chance they will find some way to cut out the card and run it in some other way. But as a high-level deck that loses basically nothing else, I think that Kinko Wayfinder is going to kind of stand strong. And again, anything that doesn't get nerfed will relatively get better. And this is kind of like, right now, what tier 1 is looking like for me, right? It's gonna look like this. What I will say is I don't expect full-on aggro to be great. So there is some idea of aggro, and I don't know, I think it'll probably be some kind of like, you know, Nox PNZ discard aggro will actually be sweet, but I think that the mid-range implications in this meta are going to be keeping out aggro in general. And make no mistake, this is a mid-range deck, right? So, because Demacia is getting buffed, mid-range decks are kind of going to be, you know, I mean, you might say that mid-range decks have kind of always been the thing, but, I mean, Ezreal has definitely lost some value, for sure. Ezreal's basically mid-range. Elnuck anything is mid-range, right? But the second order, yeah, second order works. Second order implications of this are basically that mid-range is probably getting stronger, which means that there will be some kind of like control deck that will be able to go over it and outvalue it long term. And I do personally think that that will be a version of like Lux that skews a little slower. Like honestly, I mean if you just run this deck, like this deck should be kind of favored against the Allegiance, right? It's like Elusive will probably beat this. This will probably beat this, if anything. Although, it's actually going to be close. It's like, Elusive might be like 5% favored, maybe. I don't even know if this will be favored, but it could be. But yeah, these are probably like the 3 tier 1 decks, I would say. I think that's gonna be how it works out. So, that is my meta assessment here. And then all we have left to do is get into the actual deck builds. This concept gets stronger in an absolute sense after the patch, but it gets weaker in a relative sense. And the reason for that is kind of like a little strange, but basically the normal elusive deck with Wayfinder gets weaker, but only absolutely weaker. Relative to other decks in the meta, it gets stronger, if anything, because other decks are getting weaker, right? Here, let me draw this in paint. This is actually like it's weird to explain this. It's gonna be a strange thing to understand. So, it's like, there's 2 ways of evaluating things. It's like relative or absolute. And a deck can get, so like you've got like the normal Wayfinder deck gets worse in an absolute sense, but it gets better in a relative sense, okay? Which is to say, it's losing Conspirator, right? That's how it gets worse. It is literally a new version of this deck would lose to an old version of this deck. The old version doesn't exist anymore. But because other decks are getting weaker, this deck is going to have a higher play rate, right? It is going to be more of a part of the meta. So the red arrow is the one that kind of matters, right? Other decks get nerfed harder? Yeah, but that's not the concept I'm explaining. The concept I'm explaining is a bit more simple, okay? Or sorry, a bit more complex. I said that backwards. So the concept I'm explaining is why the Demacia version of this is Demacia, this circle will represent Demacia. The Demacia version gets absolutely, well, okay, it doesn't get absolutely better. It gets better relative to the Kinko version, but it gets worse relative to the overall meta. And it's really, really strange how that all works out. The reason why that is because this deck is better, it's good against the Kinko, or sorry. This deck gets countered, the Demacia deck gets countered by the Kinko version, right? That is why Burn fell off. It's pretty straightforward to see, because Relentless Pursuit and Standalone are cards that are really good when the opponent can't block your elusives, but are really bad when the opponent can. Right? They don't win the mirror. So, the Demacia version of Burn, compared to the Allegiance version of Burn, gets relatively better, because they lose Conspirator, and the Demacia version loses nothing. So this version gets relatively better in that matchup. But because the relativistic value of Kinko goes up, its play rate on the ladder will go up. Its representation on ladder will go up. And because even though this deck is going to be better against a version of Conspirator that has one less attack, its its relative value on the meta will go down. Because even though its win rate against the Kinko will go up, the Kinko's play rate will go up by more than that. Which means that the red arrows are the only things that matter. Like, this is what you have to understand. The Kinko version is getting better overall, and the Demacia version is getting worse overall. Okay? It's a little complicated, and I think I could have explained that, like, slightly better. But there's three different things happening here. Metas are very, very complicated things. I don't think the Demacia version can work for no other reason than the relativistic value of the Kinko deck goes up, which means this one has to go down, because this deck gets countered by the Kinko deck, even if it's a softer counter than it was before, right? Kinko is going to oppress Demacia elusives. Basically, yes. But the reasoning, the way you come to that conclusion is strange and counterintuitive. Okay. It's like explaining stock trading. Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's all just investments, right? It's all the same thing. So it's like, okay, so aggro beats control beats mid-range beats aggro, okay? And this is like, it's kind of a rule of thumb. There's going to be some exceptions to this, but overall this ends up being true. If you want, like, you know, maybe a slightly better visualization of that, I add a little graphic to my site under the matchup tables, which I still need to update this. This is going to be updated probably tomorrow, okay? Okay. So, the way aggro I see working in this meta, it could be discard Jinx, it could be spiders. I think it's more likely going to be Demacia with Zed. Zed is kind of like an angry pink dude. Okay, that's Demacia Zed. Basically the deck I'm showing off right now. The control is probably going to be like Spooky Karma or Ezreal. He's got the fist. There we go. Something like that. That's going to be like the control package for what you expect to see in the meta. And then for mid-range, it's going to be like more Demacia. Demacia in some mid-range capacity. Hard to say what. You can lump like the elusives Wayfinders into this too. Like those are going to be like two different mid-range decks. And for the most part, the thing about Runeterra is like the mid-range is kind of heavily incentivized, and it's always going to stabilize at a higher play rate. And that's why these two decks, which are probably like Demacia mid-range, I don't know what that's going to be. It could be Lux something. Lux could also skew control somewhat. Could be like this like Lux package with the new Redeemer Mage Seeker thing. Or it could just be a Bannerman deck that runs maybe Garen and replaces Zed with something that slow plays the game a bit more. That's going to be mid-range. And these are going to be the best decks in the game. These are going to be like the tier 1 auto decks. Then, like, the aggro, this is going to stabilize with a lower play rate, and it's going to be basically the deck you're seeing right now, which is Demacia with the Zed Illusion version, with Relentless Pursuits. And it's using a decent amount of the same cards, but it's playing for a very different condition, which is the aggro condition, right? Probably you're running at least 2 Purifies, because being able to Purify Zed Shadow Clone is actually very cute, and being able to Purify Frostbite off to be able to beat Ezreal is very adorable. A really big question is, how does this deck do against Ruination? Is it fast enough? I think it actually is. And then, of course, we've got the control decks. Ezreal could be built in a couple different ways, but most likely, this is going to be the way to, you know, counter these mid-range decks somewhat. But again, it'll stabilize at a lower play rate, right? Like, I'm drawing these, it looks kind of equal, but in reality, this one's kind of the best category to be in most of the time, and these two are slightly more like fringe things. Like, it's probably better to be in this, and then I think these aggro builds will probably feel a bit faded out, honestly, but, I mean, this is just predictions, so it can depend, right? For the most part, I get that they aren't going to play games, but do you need to torture my eyes with these stick figures? Come on, man. Visuals help the learning process. And this is kind of where I predict the meta to go. And this is why I'm saying that it's a very Demacia skewed meta. Because as you can see, Demacia, I mean, I guess Ionia is really present here as well. But like, Demacia is representing like 2 of the 3 like core angles here. It's like, I think that Demacia aggro will maybe be the best way to play it. I don't know. I mean, there's definitely some potential with like discard Jinx or Spiders, for sure. That does have some potential. Are you lumping Freljord elusives with midrange? Yeah, basically. I mean, I would put that as a midrange deck. You could argue it's entirely antithetical to the idea of midrange, because of course the idea of midrange is like fighting for the board, and elusives just cheat the board. But I mean, they play at midrange speed. They are midrange in every way except that they aren't blockable. Where do combo decks fall into this triangle? I don't know. I know a lot of people like doing like a 4-point triangle with like combo decks, and they're like, oh yeah, aggro beats combo and control beats aggro, but combo beats control, and it's just a different way of categorizing things. At the end of the day, right now, there's not combo decks. Ezreal is, you could consider a combo deck, and I'm putting him in control. There's not, I mean, what would be a combo deck? There would be like, you could say the Hecarim like teal red style deck is kind of combo-y, that kind of works, but no, I don't think that I'm not using combo in this model. This is a 3-point triangle here.